Hey, Matt Minster here with my trusty assistant. Sorry?
I'm Suzanne, the Magnificent, and this is my trusty assistant, Matt.
That's right. And we're here with easy tips that can save you energy and money.
Like magic.
Adjusting your thermostat 7 to 10 degrees for 8 hours a day can save you up to 10% a year. And a smart thermostat can change the temperature automatically.
Abra Adjusto.
Impressive.
There's more where that came from.
LED light bulbs use up to 80% less energy and can last 25 times longer than regular light bulbs.
Ooh. Ah.
And using timed outlets can help you save even more energy.
Tickety, tockety, two.
Or try Smart Plug. Now these cool devices sync with your smartphone so that you can manage your energy
Ta-da!
with the touch of a finger. Hey, you're pretty good at that.
Thanks. Want to see another trick?
Of course.
Energy savings made easy.
Find more tips at AmeronIllinois.com/savings made easy.
And hello again, everybody. It is time for the Keith Costas podcast. Keith, of course, the MLB Network analyst. I'm Bob Ramsey. Glad you're with us, and it's good to see you. Keith, how are you, sir?
I'm good, Rammer. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. Well, a lot to talk about this week and a lot of things going on. And one of the things that's happening is we're still dealing with illness issues around baseball. MLB Network had the Padres yesterday, and they're battling through some COVID issues.
Yeah, it's kind of a bummer for Cardinals fans. You think about the last couple of weeks. Last week you're set to watch a matchup with Jacob deGrom, and he ends up going on the IL. Not a COVID situation, but ends up missing that start. And then you got the weekend series coming up with the Padres here, and it looks like they're going to be without about half of their regulars. Now, some of those guys were just kind of out the last couple of days for contact tracing, so who knows if they'll make it back in a shorter time than expected. But yeah, you're still seeing some positive tests pop up here and there. It's kind of a catch-22. You're getting the emails every day about teams, including the Cardinals, kind of opening back up as far as more capacity in the stands. But at the same time, we are still dealing with the pandemic, and there are positive tests popping up around the league, which you hate to see.
Yeah, and so it will be interesting to see how the Padres handle that, and if the shorter quarantine times can help them get back on the field. And certainly we all hope so, because the Padres, when at full force, are a pretty exciting club to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And just looking at some of their numbers, one of the things that stood out to me, especially with Yachty behind the plate for the Cardinals, is they run like it's the 80s, this Padres team. I think they already have 50-something stolen bases, and no other team has even gotten to 40. So, and it's not like they've just got jackrabbits that they bring off the bench or slap hitters at the bottom of their lineup. Their stars all run. Tatis, Machado, Myers, all these guys will run. So it's a really entertaining style of baseball, not just with the swing and miss pitching and the guys that can hit it out of the ballpark, but they play an athletic brand of baseball, which obviously has been a big talking point these last couple of years. Not enough action on the bases, not enough balls in play. That's not what you're going to get with the Padres. So hopefully we'll get to see some of those guys on the field this weekend. Now, going back to what you were talking about with just the overall numbers of who they're missing, part of what makes it so tough for them is two of the guys that are out with COVID situations right now for them are Mateo and Profar, who can play literally all over the field. So they're not just missing a bunch of guys. They're missing some of the pieces that theoretically could help them sustain through a situation like this. So tough spot for the Padres for sure.
So I want to tie what you were just talking about with the Padres into two other topics, and we'll kind of lump it all together, and then we can break it down. And it gets into analysis, what you do, instead of a talking head like me that just shoots from the hip and spouts off old school philosophies. But there's so much talk about the 3 true outcome, and we've been I don't know if advocating or pushing for it for a decade. I think that is a philosophical failure in the game, and I think the Padres, and I think the White Sox, and I think the Astros prove that you don't have to play that way. In fact, the way the game's been played for most of the last century is the way to do it. So we mentioned the Padres. Now let's go to the White Sox, best record in baseball. And, they were up and down. A few weeks ago, Tony had a new rule hiccup, and but the team didn't care. not only do they keep playing, they started playing better.
Yeah, absolutely. They are absolutely rolling right now. We had them on MLB Network last night after that Padres game that you mentioned, and Tony's team has now scored 9+ runs in 4 straight games. I was shocked. It's the first time a La Russa team has ever done that. All the Bash brothers,
Wow.
McGuire, Pujols, all these great players, great lineups
Yeah.
he's managed. He's never seen that kind of output. Now, 4 games, does that mean he's the best offense he's ever coached? No, but still kind of an interesting tidbit. But yeah, Rammer, you hit it right on the head. They've got some interesting guys in their lineup. Now, to the 3 true outcomes point, we had Grandal in that game last night go deep. He's hitting something like 120 with an on-base percentage close to 400. I mean, it's literally the biggest gap in average and on base in the history of baseball. So they've still got some of those guys in the lineup. Yeah. But then again, last night you see Billy Hamilton with a 4-hit game. He almost hit for the cycle, just a home run shy. And he's obviously not a guy that's going to hit home runs. So Tony's comfortable putting those guys in the lineup. And I'm totally with you in terms of the mix of their offense. They've got the mashers, obviously. They've got the reigning MVP. They've got Grandal. They've got guys like that do maybe have more of a new school approach, but they've got these kind of gadget guys that they can play Tony's more old school style too, more contact oriented hitters towards the bottom of their lineup. Even one of their stars like Tim Anderson, he's not too interested in walking, but he's going to hit over 300 every year, which, we've talked about before. It's almost like a dirty word if you talk about batting average, but that happens to count for your on-base percentage too. You can get on with a hit. That's not a bad thing. It actually happens. I know this is shocking. It happens to be a more productive thing than a walk. But I digress. Right. Yeah, I'm with you 100%. These teams kind of mixing in more contact guys and having a more diversified approach as opposed to just these 3 true outcome guys stacked 1 through 9, just ranking them in terms basically of how much they get on base and let's see what happens. Now, Tony's team's got a little bit more of a situational feel, and they've been fun to watch so far for sure.
Yeah, and another thing, for those who are around La Russa throughout his entire Cardinal tenure, like I was, one of the things that was a hallmark in the way he wanted to manage and have his team play. Couldn't always achieve it, but he always used the one word, push. He wanted to push the game, force the issue, make the other team react, put them on their heels, and I love the word you use, diversified. Having a diversified attack that you can go after the opposition in so many different ways, that really fits La Russa, and I think it's good for the game.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And getting a chance to talk to Tony before the game yesterday, I felt like it was back in those St. Louis days. All the same kind of catchphrases that we've heard a million times were still in play. Ask me in 4 hours how I'm doing. Talked about winning the inning, which is sort of what we're talking about here too, forcing the issues. He talked about, people like to talk about crooked numbers, but is it always better to play for the crooked number as opposed to just getting a run on the board and kind of changing the makeup of the game? I got one eye on the Cardinals as we record this on Thursday playing the Brewers today. You saw that in the first inning. Yep. Edman gets on, he steals, move him over, little ground ball dribbler that gets through on the left side. And now the whole dynamic of the game has changed and what could be a pitching ace matchup today between Burns and Flaherty. So yeah, Tony is, he was receptive to a lot of the new school stuff. We got into that when we had a chance to meet with him before the game. He gave a lot of credit to the analytics department. He's got Shelley Duncan, Dave's son, there working with him on the analytics side. He's really dove into that stuff. So kind of a familiar voice to help him get on board with some of the changes that have happened since he's been out of the game, but still plenty of room for sort of a unique thought process that Tony brings to it as opposed to this cookie cutter sort of approach we've seen across the league with everyone sort of using the same or at least a similar model, analytically driven model to put their teams together.
Yeah, that's great stuff. I wish I'd have been in on that conversation. La Russa is one of my all-time favorites, and I love the way he thinks the game. Now, let's take that same topic and open up a whole nother basket because there's other levels to it, and that's the Houston Astros, who they're struggling some, but I love what they're doing with their offense, Keith. And correct me on my numbers. I think it's either 4 or 5 hitters that are hitting at or near 300, all with like 340 to 400 on base with power. And if they can figure out some other aspects, they're going to be right back in it.
Yeah, I'm with you. And another guy, obviously, with some similarity, maybe not the best of friends, but another old school guy in Dusty at the helm there. I'm with you on the Astros offense. And that was a thing, even going back, it's a little awkward to talk about now, given what we know about the sign stealing and everything that went down in Houston. But when they really started to turn the corner, they talked a lot about swinging at good pitches in the zone and limiting chase outside of the zone, which seems like a simple enough concept, but all too often, kind of going back to the theme we're talking about, that low chase rate has been more of the concern in the modern game than really being aggressive in the strike zone too. I mean, it's fine to walk. It's obviously good to be a patient and disciplined hitter, but if you're going to be a guy like, and it's sort of a catch-22, like I said, because these guys are good hitters, but a Max Muncy or a Yasmani Grandal who's literally taking 75% of the pitches they see. Well, yeah, you're going to draw some walks that way, but it's going to be tough to collect hits if you're not ready to pull the trigger in the zone. And that's something that Houston has kind of been known for over the years, and it's definitely coming into play for them again this year offensively. And I don't think that division, I mean, obviously the A's had a very hot stretch, but the bottom half of that division isn't really much to contend with. Seattle got off to a hot start, but they don't really have much staying power. So I think at the end of the day, the Astros are going to be right there at the end of the season competing for a playoff spot, the same spot they've been for the last half decade or so.
I'm going to make a mistake here that lawyers are never supposed to make about asking a question you don't have an answer to. We didn't talk about this, but it's interesting you're talking about chase rate, taking pitches. We've always been taught taking pitches, getting deep into the count. But can there be a negative side? And I wonder, this just popped into my head listening to your analysis. Could that be part and parcel to the downward trend of a guy like a Matt Carpenter in St. Louis that was known so long for taking so many pitches that could have been a contributor in his downward offensive spiral?
Yeah, I mean, hard to say, obviously, without being in his mind and talking to him every day, but I think that's a completely reasonable theory to have. I mean, it's just hard to ask these guys to hit the type of pitching that we're seeing now. And I mean, I know it sounds crazy to act like things have changed in a short period of time, 4, 5, 6 years, but it's a completely different game in terms of the types of pitching that's being thrown at these guys, the velocity, the way they're approached. It's just totally different from when Matt Carpenter, it's certainly different from when he was a high average second baseman, but it's even different than 3-4 years ago when he was more of that on-base slugger type that was pulling everything and hitting a lot of homers and a lot of doubles. It's just a totally different game on the pitching side, and it's changing at warp speed almost. So, having not stood in the box, obviously, in the major leagues, who knows? But I think it's completely reasonable to think that more conservative, passive approach really puts these guys in a tough spot when it is time to pull the trigger.
Yeah, and when we talk about those kinds of hitters, I need to offer a disclaimer because I've had a little bit of feedback. Oh, you hate home runs. No, I love home runs. But, and you touched on it at the very beginning of the show, I love action. That's what we want. And if you get a beautiful pitching performance, that's great. A 2-1 game, a 1-0 game, that's great. But we all know that you're not regularly going to get that kind of pitching when you go 1 through 5 in a rotation and deep into bullpens. And so then I love action. And I think that's what fans, whether they know it or not, really want to see.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. And just on the same kind of theme of this modern baseball, one of the buzzwords has obviously been launch angle and all these StatCast numbers. But an interesting thing about this season, I mean, 2 guys don't make a trend for the whole league, but you look at launch angle, the 2 guys who have decreased their launch angle the most from last year to this year, Byron Buxton and Mike Trout. They're arguably been the 2 best players in baseball this year.
Wow.
So you don't have to swing on an uphill plane every time if you want to do damage, want to collect extra base hits. It's okay to hit line drives, especially if you're athletic like those guys, Buxton and Trout. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think fans want more of that. And I do think that it's sort of coming back around in terms of guys aren't going so all in on this sort of launch angle, sellout for power, strikeouts don't matter. I think that is sort of starting to turn because like we've talked about before, I mean, the whole idea of analytics in sports is finding that sort of undervalued or, that market value that isn't being exploited by all the teams. That's how Moneyball started. It wasn't as much that they unlocked that on-base percentage was the most important stat. It's that other teams weren't valuing it as the most important stat.
Right.
So once the other 29 teams get on board, it doesn't mean that you go out and get a bunch of guys that have, 295 on base percentages. Obviously, you still want guys that get on base, but it's not as valuable to go find a Scott Hatteberg when every team is looking for that same type of player. So I think that guys are getting back to a more, again, that word we talked about before, sort of a more diversified approach throughout the team, playing to their natural skills, their natural talent, their natural athleticism, especially, as opposed to just everyone trying to kind of fit this cookie cutter mold.
Yeah, and one final thought on that, to not beat this up because we may touch on it as the summer goes on, but I think of two guys you mentioned, Trout, and then not to be too St. Louis centric, but a guy like Tyler O'Neill, who the St. Louis outfielder, who is so doggone strong. I wish, and he's hitting better in these first 6 weeks than he has in a while, putting more balls in play, more plate discipline, that sort of thing. But some of these guys are so strong. I think if you put in your head, we'll pay you just as much if you win a batting title, they'd still hit 30 bombs because they're so strong.
Yeah, 100%.
They're so strong, they don't have to have launch angle.
I mean, how about that ball that O'Neill hit out last night? That looked like a routine fly ball, at least off the bat. It looked like a routine fly ball that maybe not shallow right field, but I didn't think there was any chance that ball was going out. And you watch the outfielders like on all these plays to see how the ball's carrying, but on that play in particular, it didn't really look like he thought after 2 or 3 steps he had any chance to catch it. That ball just carried out. It was low. He picked it up off the dirt basically and just flipped it out. So, yeah, I'm with you. A more line drive approach. These guys, O'Neill being a perfect example. I love that you brought him up. They're going to get their hits and they're going to get their home runs with that.
So what do you how interested are you going to be in looking at some of the minor league changes, like moving the pitching rubber back and looking at that analysis and trying to figure out how that could translate to the big leagues? And then there was I forget, in Florida, the low A league, that they're scoring 100 runs a game. They've made some changes. So it'll be interesting to see, okay, we're experimenting some things in the minor leagues, but I think it's people like you, Keith Costas, that'll say, how does that translate and how can our analysis prove it?
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to watch it play out. They're kind of taking, like you alluded to, they basically assigned one fairly drastic rule change to each minor league level. So it's not like we're going to get a chance to see all of these things working in concert, but it'll certainly be interesting after the season to take stock of what the overall effect was. And I think you hit on it. Moving the mound back is the one that's gotten the most traction. It's hard to say what the effect might be on injuries, but just, going back to what you talked about earlier, just shooting from the hip here, I have a hard time believing. I understand there'll be a transition period, but in the grand scheme of things, I have a hard time buying into guys' arms are going to start falling off if they throw from 61 feet instead of 60 feet. It just doesn't track to me. I understand that you're going to have to train a little different. There'll be a change in the way the ball breaks with the extra foot. There's all kinds of, guys are literally breaking things down at 10,000 frames per second. There's going to be some changes when you add an extra foot into the way things have been done for the last 100 years. But these guys are athletic. Again, it's almost like in baseball sometimes there's a hesitancy to tap into athleticism, like you're not playing a sport. Common sense. These guys are athletes. Let them be athletes. And I just have a hard time believing that some of the best athletes in the world are going to have a problem with that extra distance between the mound and the plate. And if you believe the physics and the studies that the league has put out in terms of what drove this change, they say that that'll drive the perceived velocity from the hitter's perspective down a couple miles an hour, or at least a mile an hour or two. And that could make a change. If that gets more balls in play, then let's go for it. But I think when you talk to guys that have played, a lot of the guys that we have at MLB Network, the biggest thing that they advocate for is they got to change the strike zone. Now, there's different opinions on how they change the strike zone, but the one that I seem to hear the most from the former players that I get to work with on a daily basis is that the high fastball is just too much. It's too much with how hard guys throw now, and they've got to lower the strike zone. John Smoltz has been hammering away at this for the last couple of years, that maybe bringing the strike zone down and just taking the high fastball and making it a little less relevant than it is now, not taking it out of the game, obviously, but the high fastball has just become such an important pitch. Even like we talked about with Carpenter, even just go back and look 5-6 years ago, and the rate and the velocity at which guys are pitching in the top third of the zone and above has just skyrocketed. And just from a physics standpoint, it's hard to hit when every staff has 4, 5, 6. Yeah, every staff's got 4, 5, 6 guys pumping those high fastballs at 98, 99 miles an hour. it just is what it is. Guys aren't going to be able to hit those pitches. I mean, even Mike Trout. It's the one thing guys have said about Mike Trout for his whole career. He's basically Superman, except the high fastball. That might be the one place where you can get him. He's addressed that a little bit in the last couple of years, but that was, even for Trout, the high fastball has been sort of a kryptonite. So I think that a lot of these changes are going to be interesting, but I think that the strike zone itself might be the single biggest driver of those low averages, low in-play percentages that we've seen.
That's fascinating, and that's why it's the Keith Costas podcast. What's coming up next for MLB Network?
We've got, for me personally, got a little break in our game schedule here, but we'll get back to it at the end of May. We've got some Braves games coming up, and then finally a gift for the St. Louis, and I think we'll get to do some Cardinal games here about 2-3 weeks away. So I'll get to put out all of my St. Louis propaganda to a national audience, and we'll see where that goes.
Keith, beautiful. Really appreciate it, and thanks to our sponsors and, of course, my friends at Royal Banks of Missouri, and you and I will visit again next week.
Sounds good, Rammer. Thanks.
That's Keith Costas. I'm Bob Ramsey on the Keith Costas podcast.